You've all gone quiet now. Like I need a good joke. Okay. Is that working? Yes, it is. Hello. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Wentworth Woodhouse. It's lovely to see some familiar faces. I was saying earlier that I definitely think we need to get those sort of Starbucks loyalty cards for some of you. You'll hear every so often, and I ever such enjoy spending time here in this lecture series. This is the last lecture of our current series. So we'll be kickstarting the lectures again in the autumn. And we're very, very open to suggestions of what you might want to see. So if there are any topics, anything that you've always wanted to know about and haven't yet found the answer, you can catch me afterwards and we can have a chat. And then actually my job to go and find something that will answer your questions. Or if you've ever seen a particularly brilliant speaker that you think would work really, really well at Wentworth, do let us know. Tonight, if you hear the fire alarm, you will know it's the fire alarm. It's very loud. And if that happens, just look for me and I will lead you out to safety. So you'll be completely fine. If you need to use the facilities, if you need to pop to the bathroom during the talk, you can just get up and go. You don't have to put your hands up. It will just be out of this door and down the long corridor, and it'll be on your right-hand side. So feel free to do that. At the end of our lecture tonight, there is the chance for some questions. So my challenge to you is to think of something to ask. So it would be lovely to be able to pass the mic to some of you in the audience. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Lizzy Spencer, who is a lecturer at the University of York. Tonight's lecture is in a really timely month. We've got a couple of days left of Women's History Month. So it seems really appropriate that tonight we are talking about women keeping the books. So without further ado, I'll hand over.
Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you so much for having me this evening. It's really, really lovely to be here. And thank you to the team at Wentworth Woodhouse for organising this evening, and particularly kind of Victoria and Andy for making sure that everything runs smoothly. So I'm really pleased to be here tonight. Before I start properly, however, I just want to do a kind of quick poll really and ask whether there are any accountants or any former accountants in the room. Okay, so there are a couple of you. So I apologise in advance for any mistakes in my understanding of accounting or bookkeeping. Like many of the women I'm going to be talking about in the talk this evening, I'm still getting to grips with these skills. And as a historian, numbers are not necessarily my strong suit. But as I hope to show this evening, looking at accounts can tell us quite a lot really about the lives of early modern English women. So I want to start tonight with a woman named Elizabeth Wentworth, which I think is particularly appropriate to kind of talk about a member of the Wentworth family, given where we are. So Elizabeth Wentworth was the daughter of a man named Sir George Wentworth, who was brother to Sir Thomas Wentworth, the first Earl of Strafford. Elizabeth had at least 4 siblings, so she had 3 brothers and 1 sister, who unfortunately died very young. And she married a man named Sir Edward Peake of Hills Court in Kent in 1671. After marrying, Elizabeth gave birth to at least 1 son, though her husband died quite soon after their marriage in 1678. And Elizabeth herself died on the 29th of February 1692. So not much is actually known about Elizabeth Wentworth's life, and very few sources relating to her seem to survive really. I've had a dig about in the archives, and I can find very little. And indeed, I'm not quite sure of her exact birth date. So one biographical account of the Wentworth family suggests that she was around 43 when she died in 1692, giving her a birth year of around 1649. But I haven't been able to find specific confirmation of this. However, even though we don't know much about Elizabeth Wentworth, I want to talk tonight about an account book that she kept for almost 10 years between 1655 and 1664, and you can see it on the screen here. So these were obviously the years before she married, and the account book reflects really, really nicely the life and expenditures of a young single gentlewoman in this period. Though I do think that it was unlikely that she was only 6 years old, when these accounts start, and kind of given their content and relative sophistication. I'll be interested to see what you think. But I think she was perhaps born a little bit earlier than 1649. But perhaps she was a maths genius, I don't know. So in some ways, Elizabeth Wentworth's account book isn't a particularly exceptional example of an early modern woman's accounts. Though, as we'll see, she was a relatively early adopter of kind of a style of accounting which saw her balancing her expenditures against her income. However, I've looked at lots of account books in my time, and I have to say, I think I find hers to be one of the most charming examples that I've come across for a number of reasons, really. I mean, first, as you can hopefully see from the image on the screen, so my hand is there for scale. The account book's relatively small. It's this quite sweet, small book. So it's around the size of my hand. And I think it's really easy to imagine this young woman kind of carrying it around with her as she went on adventures and visited new places, keeping it perhaps in her pocket. So this is just one example of a double page spread from the account book. But I think it gives a good sense of how she was keeping accounts. And of course, you know, if you kind of remember the size of the book, this is actually quite small writing. So on your left-hand side, you can see that she kept account of her income, noting how much money she'd received and from whom. So in this particular entry, for example, we can see that she received £13 and 2 shillings in total. Then on the right-hand page, you can see that she kept this list of her expenditures, which came to a total of £9, 19 shillings and 10 pence. So after balancing her accounts, which you can see kind of here, this left her with £3, 2 shillings and 2 pence left to spend. So you can see this total here where she's noted what remains. Interestingly, I'm not sure how well you can see this, but in this account, it's here. She just kind of notes that £4, 11 shillings and 6 pence was lost. She doesn't say where it was lost or how it was lost. And if you think about it, this £4 is quite a sizable chunk of the almost £10 that she spent. So we know from Elizabeth Wentworth's account book that her income came primarily from her parents, from someone named Collie, who was perhaps a servant of the family, and from other familial relations like Lady Rockingham and Lady Strafford. And I think this income was something akin to an allowance or pocket money, really. You know, it wasn't a huge sum on its own, but it was enough for Elizabeth to spend on herself. So from 1657 onwards, actually, she did also appear to become responsible for paying her own maid's wages. But of course, as a young unmarried woman, she wasn't responsible really for kind of clothing or housing or feeding herself. And so her expenditures were largely small and personal. And so, for example, on this page, we can see that she paid for, amongst other things, a pair of shoes, for a letter, for cherries and fruit, for ribbon, for a thimble, for a smoothing iron, a silver lace, fabric, and a hat. And indeed, I mean, this is one of the reasons I quite like her, really, and because a significant proportion of Elizabeth Wentworth's money went towards her wardrobe. So she was frequently purchasing things like textiles, accessories, or paying to have things made up for herself. She also quite regularly gave small amounts of money to people, either as a charitable cause, so she gave lots of money to poor men and women, for example, to servants, or for services rendered. And so I'm not sure how well you can see, but on this page we can see that she gave the coachman, for example, 2 shillings and 6 pence. We can also see from her account book as a whole that she was participating in the growing consumer society of the 17th century in a number of different ways. So she made purchases of things like sugar candy, sugar and coffee, as well as Indian gowns. So we get a picture from this account book of a young woman spending her allowance on things like clothing and small luxuries, as well as enjoying an active social life. And so from looking at her accounts, we can see her moving around different households quite often, actually, staying with family and friends, and also making visits to places like London, where her expenditure kind of sees a massive spike while she's there. And I think it's not hard to imagine really this small pocketbook coming with her on these journeys. So although in some ways then Elizabeth Wentworth lived quite a sophisticated, genteel lifestyle, I also find her account book charming, because we also get these reminders really that she was, just a young woman or a young girl. And there are examples like this one here throughout the book where we can see her kind of doodling or practicing her signature. And so as well as Elizabeth Wentworth, we get Betty Wentworth, for instance. So she's kind of experimenting perhaps with what she wants to call herself. In the right-hand image, we can see that she copied out the title of a book on arithmetical questions several times. I was really hoping to find that this might be the book that she used to learn how to keep accounts or to kind of practice arithmetic. But unfortunately, it seems to be a title that was actually published after her accounts end. But these kind of practices, so writing out her signature, copying book titles, practicing writing numbers, are very, very similar really to a lot of children's exercise books from this period. And this kind of makes me wonder really whether this little account book was also in part a practice manual. So a low stakes way for her to learn how to account for and manage expenditure. And perhaps this was something she was encouraged to do as she moved between households, stayed with different family members. But I think some of these suggest that she's still learning in some ways. I think the most endearing aspect of Elizabeth Wentworth's account book, however, is the way that we can see her, for want of a better word here, really kind of fudging her accounts. So there are hints in the account book that at times she kind of massaged the numbers and gave a slightly different picture of her expenditure than was actually the case. So, for example, in some instances, we can see that she certainly wasn't noting down every single thing that she purchased. So this page is around halfway through the account book, and it dates from 1661. And the title of this page, she writes, "Besides the sums mentioned in this book, these sums following have been and must be paid to my use." And then what follows is a list of purchases, including the huge sum really of £44 owed to her tailor, which don't appear anywhere else in the book. And if you add them up, these expenditures also far exceeded her own recorded income for that year. So the account book is definitely not recording everything that she's buying. It's not reflective of all of her purchases. And we can see another similar example here. So while in 1657, Elizabeth had noted that 3 pence, again, had been lost in this account. We don't know where. She never used this phrase again. However, this double page entry spread for 1661 shows that at first, her expenditures were on track to exceed her income. So she spent £1, 16 shillings and 10 pence when she only had £1, 10 shillings and 5 pence in her possession. But we can see from this page that rather than kind of simply accounting for this as loss, what she actually does is crosses out these two entries at the bottom of the page. So these are purchases for shoes, for a pair of shoes, and for apples. And by crossing these two things out, she brings her expenditure in line with her income and balances the account at zero. And these shoes and apples never appear again. I've not managed to find them anywhere else in the account book. So I think we can kind of see her being quite savvy here, really. And this is another kind of final example, really. This is the last page of her account book, which ends very, very abruptly in 1664 without being balanced at all. If we follow it, we can see that, again, she was on track to exceed her income. So spending £1, 7 shillings and 10 pence when she only had 14 shillings and 3 pence remaining. She doesn't actually take the step to highlight this though, simply ending the account with this kind of lovely looped signature, which I don't think is a particularly sneaky way to disguise this. So perhaps, these examples are simply evidence of bad maths. Maybe Elizabeth Wentworth wasn't very good at keeping track of or adding up her expenditure. But I do think that we might also consider the possibility that she was learning through keeping this account book, how to manage the appearance of financial solvency, so how to appear creditworthy, and was well aware really of how to present a favourable account of her spending. So clearly, she wasn't kind of in dire straits or facing financial ruin. She was being given a small allowance, but other people were paying for other things for her. So I think it's really interesting that she was set the task of keeping track of it in this way. And I think these are skills that she might perhaps have taken forward in her life, you know, to her marriage and to her future household management. And indeed, this was something that the famous diarist Samuel Pepys accused his own wife of doing, writing in 1664 that I did go to examine my wife's house accounts, and finding things that seemed somewhat doubtful, I was angry, though she did make it pretty plain, but confessed that when she do miss a sum, and she do add something to other things to make it. And his wife is kind of massaging her accounts as well and making them appear balanced when they perhaps weren't. And of course, you may know that Pepys's own diary entries started life as financial accounts, demonstrating how important this form of record keeping could be for early modern people. So I think Elizabeth Wentworth is a really nice example to start with, because she was one of increasing numbers of women keeping accounts across the 17th and 18th centuries in England. While elite women had certainly kept accounts in earlier years, in this period, women from a range of social ranks were cultivating numerical skills and keeping the books for various purposes. And from the 16th century onwards, printed guides outlining systems for financial accounting became increasingly popular, reaching their peak in the 18th century. And this kind of resulted in widespread knowledge, really, as well as an increasing professionalisation and standardisation of accounting practice, at least in theory, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And one of the key developments in this period was a shift from Roman numerals, or numbers written out in prose, to the use of Arabic numbers, as we are familiar with today. Though this was by no means kind of a clean break. So some accountants, for example, continue to use both Arabic and prose numbers alongside one another, for instance. And of course, there remained a number of other ways for those who were not necessarily numerate to keep track of money received, spent, or owed. And I think that's a really important point to highlight. Although women across the social hierarchy had, you know, in some instances, very, very good numeracy skills, it was financially numerate and literate women who were able to keep account. So historians have placed a lot of emphasis on the increasing importance of double entry bookkeeping prescribed by many of these printed guides for accounting, which could act as a mark of truthfulness and honesty in a business and mercantile context. And indeed, one historian has kind of made the bold claim that, quote, without double entry accounting, neither modern capitalism nor the modern state could exist. So by prescribing a specific format and method for keeping account, double entry bookkeeping played an important role in establishing widely held standards of accurate accounting, which in theory could stand up under external scrutiny. And one thing that frustrates me a little bit is that women tend to get kind of left behind in this story, which focuses largely on the commercial, mercantile, and business role played by accounting in the early modern period. However, although historians have kind of stressed the importance of double entry bookkeeping, the actual use of the double entry system of accounting remained very patchy in practice right up to the 19th century. So not everyone was taking it up. As we've already seen, Elizabeth Wentworth was a relatively early adopter of a similar system where she was balancing her income and expenditure. And there's ample evidence to suggest that many women were perfectly competent in using this system of accounting. Nevertheless, a number of early modern accountants, both men and women, simply used kind of a single ledger or several ledgers to keep lists of income and expenditure, rather than balancing the books, while elite men and women remained less likely to use a double entry system of accounting than their commercial counterparts in the middling classes. But while this kind of uptake of double entry bookkeeping was uneven, it is quite clear that the dissemination of printing accounting guides contributed to increasing kind of shared standards across the 17th and 18th century. So it did see quite a big change. It's possible that some early modern women used these kinds of printed guides to learn how to account. But unfortunately, it's just really difficult to determine how so many of them learnt the skills of accounting, even though they clearly did. What we do have are a number of examples of arithmetic exercise books, like this one on the screen from 1685, which belonged to a woman named Sarah Cole. And I just really love it because you can see that she was kind of doing these lovely doodles alongside these mathematical exercises. And it's a very beautiful book, really. However, just who was teaching them how to keep account remains really elusive. And formal schooling for women in accounting wasn't common really until the later 18th century. As it was women from the elite, gentry and commercial classes who were most likely to learn how to keep accounts. And there's some consensus that this happened in the home, with them perhaps being taught by mothers, fathers, or family members. And indeed, I've already suggested that this might be what's going on with Elizabeth Wentworth's account book, which we could read as this kind of training exercise. So perhaps she was being taught by family members within the home. But it's really, really difficult to find evidence for this. It's difficult to prove this. Because women were unlikely to receive formal education in accounting, this means that at times, I think it's fair to say, their accounts can be a little bit idiosyncratic, with evidence that they adapted systems for bookkeeping for their own needs and to their own ends. However, I think it's really important to highlight that this doesn't necessarily reflect a failure to follow formal systems of accounting, like double entry bookkeeping. And if we only judged women's surviving accounts by the standards of these prescriptive printed manuals, I think we'd miss a huge amount of detail about their lives. So as we've already seen, both men and women were slow to take up the double entry system of bookkeeping across the early modern period. And surviving accounts demonstrate that actually, in practice, there were relatively few differences between the systems of accounting used across genders. The differences are more likely to appear across individual, household, business, estate, and institutional accounts, rather than along these gendered lines. But this is not to say that early moderns themselves did not see a gendered division, however. So the majority of printed guides to accounting published in the 17th and 18th centuries associated accounting primarily with the commercial, mercantile, and ultimately masculine world, gendering the practice as largely male. When they do mention women, these guides often most often stress that women only really needed to acquire quite rudimentary skills in order to be able to effectively manage a household. And indeed, the qualities of prudence and good economy were understood to be essential for a wife managing a household in this period. And this emphasis on household accounting in these printed guides has meant that some historians have highlighted the potential for patriarchal surveillance of women's account books by husbands or fathers. And indeed, we do see some evidence in women's account books that they have been kind of audited really by a male head of household, checking that the figures line up. And of course, we might think back to Pepys checking his wife's accounts here. Interestingly, we've already seen that Elizabeth Wentworth made these very clear marks of ownership in her account book, so writing her name again and again. But there is also evidence of another hand in the account book. And so in several instances, the accounts have been balanced by what looks to be someone else. So you can see kind of examples here and here. This might have been Elizabeth Wentworth kind of practicing a different style of handwriting, but I do think that the hands are quite different. There was a parent or figure of authority checking her calculations. Was it perhaps an older brother making sure that she was using the correct way to keep account? Was it perhaps even another person gaining practice in balancing accounts, using her book as kind of an exemplar or practice book? I have no idea. I can't provide any clear answers to this. I haven't been able to identify whose hand this is. But I do think then that there is some potential that her accounts were audited or checked in some way. Though, as I suggested earlier, there might have been some questions raised in this process about her calculations. Whether or not women's accounts were subject to this kind of patriarchal surveillance, it is very clear, as I've already said, that printed advice for women focused on accounting as a tool for household management. So the title that you can see on the screen, The Accomplished Housewife, which was published in 1745, urged that young ladies should be acquainted with the 4 fundamental rules of arithmetic by their 7th birthday. Beyond this, however, women were not encouraged to extend their knowledge any further than that required for the basic keeping of accounts. So we shall not puzzle our female readers with any farther forms of arithmetical calculations, the book declared, but shall close this branch of their education with giving them a transient idea of the best method for keeping their accounts. And interestingly, these kinds of how-to manuals often included kind of exemplar accounts for their readers or kind of template accounts, and offering a guide for how users could model their own. So while in theory then there was absolutely this kind of very gendered divide between commercial accounting on the one hand and household accounting by women on the other, as is often the case with these things, I think this is far more complex in practice. So while the importance of a frugal and economic wife was frequently stressed in early modern advice manuals, it was also understood that both men and women had responsibility for the household expenses. So it wasn't just women's kind of responsibility. With a wife's role was focused more on the day-to-day management and provisioning of the household, while a husband's role was envisaged as more of a kind of global manager of this. And I think that this 1745 print by William Hogarth nicely illustrates the kind of role accounting could play in this context. So this is the second of a series of 6 prints illustrating kind of quite a disastrous marriage, really, between a merchant's daughter and an impoverished earl's son. And we can see that although the couple are kind of surrounded by these beautiful things, their household is in complete disarray. And to the right, so just here, I've enlarged it, we can see their kind of despairing steward leaving the room. And he's got the household account ledger tucked under his arm, and he's holding a stack of unpaid bills in his hand. And so in this instance, both the husband and the wife are neglecting the accounts. I think that this image also highlights an important final point when looking at the history of accounting in the 17th and 18th centuries, which is that accounting, and particularly double entry bookkeeping, often involved a number of different books and pieces of paper, as information was moved across and between records like the inventory, waste book, journal, and ledger. And they might be familiar to the accountants in the room, I don't know. So for instance, if we look a little bit more closely at the image that I used at the start of the talk, we can kind of see this in action. So this image was this painting was done in 1656. And I think it's a little ambiguous because it's not quite clear whether this female accountant is falling asleep because she's been diligently working at her accounts, or if she's neglecting her duties by drifting off. But either way, we can see that the account books are kind of at risk of falling off the table. However, if we look closely, we can see that she's actually in the process of transferring information from one book to another. So it's a little hard to see from this image, but this bottom book here, I think, might be a waste book where she kind of kept track of her daily transactions and wrote them down chronologically. Because we can see that they're being struck through with a line as she transfers this information to her ledger. The ledgers, or account books like the one belonging to Elizabeth Wentworth, are often all that survives of this process, which actually could involve the transfer of financial information across lots of different types of record. And this isn't to say that every single woman was using multiple books in this way to keep account, But I think it's really important to highlight that what we see in the archives is very often the end product, really, of this wider process of accounting. So I want to talk a little bit more now about household accounting and using some examples, as this was clearly understood to be a very important tool for women in early modern England, and so it can reveal a lot about their lives. I should stress that, however, although we've seen printed account manuals stressing that women only needed this very basic knowledge of accounting to be able to keep track of household expenditure, we do find lots of evidence of women keeping the books for other things in the early modern period. And so we find numerous women keeping business, commercial, estate, and investment accounts, often deploying quite complex systems of bookkeeping for this. But even accounting for the household, I think, was more complex than a lot of these contemporary manuals allowed. So for a start, keeping account of a household could involve quite carefully navigating both familial and financial relationships, and might involve collaboration with family members and household members. So if we take one example in the gentlewoman Joan Mellish of Nottinghamshire, we can see this. So Joan was the widowed matriarch of a family with at least 6 surviving adult children from 2 different marriages, so she had quite a complex family. And a household account book belonging to her survives for the years 1706 to 1709, showing how she was responsible for provisioning a household which still included her unmarried daughter, Sarah. But what I find really interesting is we can see from the account book that when Joan was nearing the end of her life, her daughter, Sarah, actually took over keeping the household accounts. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of it, but we can see kind of the change in the 2 hands. Although the accounts were now written in Sarah's rather than Joan's hand, they remained largely the same. So the same things were purchased, the same people were paid. However, when Joan Mellish died in January 1709, and we can see that Sarah Mellish actually stopped writing in the household account book, which was then taken over by a different hand later that month. And I think that this new hand was most likely one of Joan Mellish's daughters-in-law. And the fact that the new accountant continued to purchase the same things and pay the same people suggests that she'd now taken over the running of the household. And indeed, as an unmarried woman, Sarah Mellish would spend the remainder of her life after her mother's death moving between the households of various relatives, and we know this because she kept her own personal account book. So we can see that in this instance, accounts were tied to the household rather than to the individual, and they reflected the changing makeup and responsibilities of that household over time. And I think this also shows us that accounting could be kind of quite a collaborative act, really, with the Mellish women clearly working together to keep the books. And indeed, they're quite a complicated family because a number of different account books belonging to different members of the family survive. And by looking at them, you can kind of see some of the complexities of accounting for a family as they were shopping for each other, lending each other money, and paying off debts, and kind of becoming entangled, really, in one another's financial accounting. So we can see the importance of accounting to household and family relationship in the early modern period, and perhaps the potential for contestation and conflict over finances as well. The Mellish family were very careful to kind of keep a paper trail to prove what was owed and what had been paid. I think Joan Mellish's account book also raises the possibility that account books could be these kind of very collaborative spaces, and spaces where women might learn to keep account. So perhaps her daughter Sarah Mellish had been given access to her mother's accounts as a young girl, for instance, and learned by practicing and doing. And I think we can see hints of this in another account book dating from 1671 to 1772, which belonged to a woman named Mrs. Plum of Tong Hall in Bradford. Unfortunately, she's one of those women for whom we don't know her first name. All that I can find is this one account book, which is a real shame, really. So Mrs. Plum had 3 adult children, 2 sons and a daughter. And it's her daughter, Fanny Plum, who appears most often in the account book, and presumably because at the age of 20, she was still unmarried and living with her parents. So while Mrs. Plum kind of certainly regularly purchased things for her daughter, we can also see from her account book that Fanny was regularly given control of spending on the house account. So on the page on the screen, for instance, we can see several entries of money, quote, given Fanny for house use. So for example, on the 5th of December 1761, Fanny was given 12 shillings for house use. And we can't tell from the account book alone, of course, but perhaps this was intended as a kind of training for Fanny, in preparation for the years when she herself would become a wife responsible for provisioning and accounting for her own household. So these have just been two very brief examples, but hopefully you can see that although accounts might seem to be these quite bald lists really of goods and prices, by looking at who kept them and how, we can find out something more about these women and their lives. Accounting was often collaborative and might often involve women working together within a household or a family, adapting these systems of accounting for their own needs and navigating multiple interests. While the printed guides to accounting that I've already spoken about often included templates and guides before the middle of the 18th century, around 1750 onwards saw another important development which prompted further changes in how women kept account of their income and expenditure. And this was the printed pocketbook, which was a genre that was increasingly popular from the 1750s onwards. I don't know if anyone's ever come across these kind of wonderful things. Yeah, they're fascinating. So this is kind of a hybrid genre. So it's quite close to the printed fashion periodicals that became increasingly popular towards the end of the 18th century. But it's also closely related to manuscript diaries and accounts. The pocketbook wasn't necessarily an entirely new thing. So it had its predecessor in things like printed almanacs, which contained a calendar as well as other useful information. So these pocketbooks were really, really small. I'm afraid I don't have a picture kind of illustrating this, but if you think back to Elizabeth Wentworth's account book, they're slightly smaller than that. So they really are kind of hand-sized. And they were designed to be portable and to fit in a woman's pocket. Indeed, many of these books actually included information designed to be consulted when on the move. So, for example, rates for coachmen and chairmen. And a number of titles, like the Lady's Own Memorandum Book or the Lady's Complete Pocketbook, were also specifically targeted at women. And here's one example from 1796, which shows what the outside of these books might look like. So they were often bound in leather like this, and the more expensively bound ones might have these kind of fastenings on them. And this example is really interesting because it belonged to the novelist Jane Porter, who frequently used pocketbooks to keep a diary. And this 1796 diary was kept in a copy of the Lady's Own Memorandum Book. But she also used a range of other titles over the years, including the Daily Journal or Gentlemen's, Merchants and Tradesmen's Annual Account Book for 1835, showing that although pocketbook titles were often gendered, this did not necessarily guarantee who their users might be. I don't have an image of it here, but there's a fantastic note at the beginning of Jane Porter's 1835 pocketbook, which reads, NB, my own expenses for January 1st, 1835 to the close of that year were within £30. Thank God, with a very kind of big exclamation mark. So they're small. Pocketbooks marketed at women had a number of printed elements. So they had printed advice, essays, quizzes, and they also had these prints at the front, which often showed the fashions for the previous years. While some of these prints survive intact in these pocketbooks, many were actually cut out and collected by women. There's a fantastic album in the V&A, for example, which was kept by a woman named Barbara Johnson, who kind of cut out and pasted these pocketbook plates into a big album along with swatches of fabric that she purchased. Significantly, however, pocketbooks like the Lady's Complete Pocketbook included these spaces for their owner to record financial accounts, as well as memoranda and remarks. And as you can hopefully see, so this is a double page spread from the Lady's Complete Pocketbook for 1762, sorry. So as you can hopefully see, these pages were kind of printed and lined and provided this table in which to record sums brought over from previous weeks, money received, money paid, and a weekly total. And these pages not only encouraged careful financial accounting, but also a kind of social accounting as well, as users were encouraged to record their social appointments. Again, they weren't entirely new. They had their predecessors in different kinds of printed books from the 17th and earlier 18th century. But I think it's quite difficult to overstate the impact of printed pocketbooks. I think there's something kind of akin to the mobile phone for us today, providing important information and a way of keeping track of oneself on the move. Of course, however, their size and this quite prescriptive formatting also meant that there were some quite clear constraints for this, with pocketbooks encouraging a very specific method for keeping account. However, this by no means ensured that they would be used in this way. And as I've already suggested, as these small portable texts, they had a usefulness which extended beyond their gendered content. And I found a number of examples of men using kind of titles like the Lady's Own Memorandum Book for various purposes. So one man used them to note down sermons, for example. We also find lots of evidence of women responding to and using their pocketbooks in a number of different ways, sometimes following their advice and sometimes ignoring it. And despite an emphasis on accounting as a tool for household management for women, for example, one historian has found evidence of 18th century women using pocketbooks to keep track of investments on the stock market, which is fantastic. And I think we can just imagine how their size and portability made them really useful for moving around the city. I think it's also important to highlight that lots of these pocketbooks, as you can see from the example on the screen, survive with very little and even no writing in them, showing that they weren't always put to use. One woman who was a faithful user of her pocketbooks, however, was actress, playwright, and author Elizabeth Inchbald. So born in 1753, Inchbald apparently began keeping a diary sometime in the 1770s, and she continued to do so for most of her life until her death in 1821. And she kept these diaries using printed pocketbooks. Although unfortunately now I think only around 11 are known to us, and they're held by the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, DC. And indeed, Inchbald's diaries kind of challenge a view of pocketbooks as these quite kind of throwaway ephemeral texts, which became obsolete after 1 year. And the printed instructions in pocketbooks actually themselves often recommended that ladies preserve their used books for future consultation. And we can see from several entries in Elizabeth Inchbald's pocketbooks that she did just that. She seemed to carry all of them around with her and consult them. She used her earlier pocketbooks to record accounts, but she stopped doing so at some point between 1783 and 1788. And you can see from her 1776 diary how Inchbald made use of the space of the printed pocketbook, with her writing kind of quite cramped and at times bursting out beyond the confines of the printed table. And indeed, actually, when I was picking this is a relatively restrained example from Inchbald. Her diary entries often encroached into her accounts. And in later years, this whole space was given over to entries for the diary. And we might ask why she chose such a small space for her diary when she apparently had so much to say. But I think particularly in her earlier years as an actress, she travelled and moved around quite a bit. And it's clear that she brought her diaries with her. And I just wanted to show you another example of one of her pocketbooks, this time from 1782. And this is something I think is really, really lovely about these. You can kind of get a sense of the size here as well. But pocketbooks themselves often had these kind of small pockets in which their users could keep things like pieces of paper. And in this example, Inchbald had kind of tucked 3 pieces of paper into this small pocket. I think 2 of them seem to be rough accounts or lists of expenditure, while the third is a receipt issued to her that same year. So as I've already said, by 1788, Elizabeth Inchbald had stopped using the accounts section of her pocketbooks altogether, which I think is really interesting. She had become successful enough to as a playwright, to retire from acting by 1789. But I think it's really unlikely that she simply stopped keeping track of her income and expenditure altogether. And indeed, a number of letters held by the forger suggest that she was quite acutely aware of money owing to her from people like publishers and playhouses, and she often wrote to people to ask that they confirm receipt of money. So it therefore suggests that it's far more likely that Inchbald began keeping account elsewhere, perhaps in a larger ledger, but that she continued to use her pocketbooks to record her diary. Another woman who used pocketbooks was a woman named Anne Prest of Bedale in North Yorkshire, who was born in 1748. And unlike Elizabeth Inchbald, we don't know that much about Anne Prest, really. Anne kept a diary in the Lady's Own Memorandum Book for 1769, 1771, 1772, and 1776, though she only used the account pages of the 1769 and 1777 diaries. And interestingly, both she and Elizabeth Inchbald actually used the same edition of the Lady's Own Memorandum Book for 1776. So as you can probably see from the screen, the two women used them very, very differently. And actually, to be fair to Anne Prest, she was actually a more diligent diarist and accountant than a number of other pocketbook users. But as you can see, her entries are usually fairly brief, noting information about her day-to-day activities and visits to family and friends, as well as lots of tea drinking. So she's drinking a lot of tea. So for this week in 1769, for instance, we can see that she drank tea and spent the evening with a Miss Wrightson on Monday, drank tea with Miss Bramley on Tuesday, took physic or medicine on Wednesday, and spent the day with Miss Bramley on Thursday. Sunday was definitely her busiest day, so she breakfasted at the London Pleasure Gardens, Bagnigge Wells, I don't know how to say that, I'm sorry. She dined and she went to Kensington Gardens. That same week, she also purchased, I'm not sure how well you can see it, but she purchased 31.5 yards of silk at a total cost of over £5. And she also spent 1 shilling and 1 pence on something that I can't quite make out. So I think it kind of reads for W, S, C, and C, which might refer to someone's initials, for example. I think it's quite tempting to imagine that it's a code for something, but we can't tell this from the pocketbook alone. So even though printed pocketbooks offer these very prescriptive ways of keeping accounts, then we can see that women actually followed this guidance to varying degrees, adapting it to their own uses and sometimes ignoring it completely. However, the pocketbook was kind of really significant in reinforcing these templates for keeping account and giving this very clear idea of what carefully kept account books should look like. Okay, and so thank you for staying with me so far. Sometimes when I tell people that I'm going to talk to them about account books, I kind of hear an audible sigh. So hopefully that's not been the case this evening. But to kind of begin to sum up really, I'd like to go all the way back to Elizabeth Wentworth's account book. Though women had been keeping accounts before this, she was writing really at the start of a period of 150 years in which more and more women would learn to keep the books, and in which this would increasingly be positioned as an essential skill for the feminine management of the household. With the increasing proliferation of printed guides, as well as developments like the pocketbook, knowledge of what well-kept accounts should look like became increasingly widespread and increasingly standardized. So as I hope I've shown, this did not always necessarily result in standardized practice. By sharing a few examples with you this evening, I hope that I've shown that early modern women might use account keeping, adapt it, and potentially deploy it creatively. And I think we can see this with Elizabeth Wentworth's accounts, both through her playful doodles and her scribal exercises, but also through the ways in which she was kind of managing her accounts and massaging some of the numbers. As I've highlighted, this was the account book of a young unmarried woman. And unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, we don't have other examples of her accounts or writings from later years. But I like to think that she took these skills forward with her. I quite like to think of her frustrating her own husband in the same way that Samuel Pepys's wife frustrated him. I think women have been largely left out of grand historical narratives which emphasised the transformative impact of the growth of accounting and the commercial role of double entry bookkeeping. But I think it's important to highlight that they were also encountering, learning, and deploying these skills in much the same way as men. You know, there were lots and lots of incredibly competent female accountants across the early modern period. And I do think it's also fair to say that I've also come across both men and women who were clearly very bad at keeping accounts. This is not to argue that women's accounting could not be subject to kind of patriarchal surveillance. And of course, a lot of pressure was placed on early modern women to conform to this ideal of the frugal housewife. And careful accounting was understood to be a very important tool in her arsenal. But in theory, at least, this required only a rudimentary working knowledge of bookkeeping. However, I think that we can think of accounts as a genre of women's writing, as something which could be collaborative, which women could experiment with, be creative with, and develop skills in over time, adapting this to their own lives and needs. And I think that accounting records tend to have a bit of a bad reputation amongst historians, and perhaps particularly historians who are trying to find out about the lives of women. While they're often seen as really useful things from which to extract information like dates, prices, goods, and income, they're usually understood to be quite impersonal, lacking the emotion of something like a letter or a diary. While women were not necessarily keeping and using their account books to record their innermost thoughts and feelings, and though of course, as we've seen in a pocketbook, the two might appear and encroach alongside one another. Looking at how and why they kept the books in early modern England, I think, can still reveal much about their lives. And I hope I've shown something of that this evening. So thank you all very much for listening. I'll be very interested for any questions you might have.
So if anyone has any questions, you have to speak into this mic, which is quite confusing because it doesn't make any sound in the room, but it makes sound for the people that are listening online. It's just so they can pick up the voices. Does anyone have any questions? Anything they'd like to ask Lizzy?
And it's two questions, really. How did you get interested in this? It's a bit niche. And where did you find these resources? Were they all in public repositories? Because obviously private archives are going to be a rich source for this kind of research too.
Yeah, two wonderful questions. Thank you. I'll take the first one to start with. My previous work is focused on women's clothing and particularly kind of women's consumption of textiles. So as I was doing this research, I was like, account books, you know, because there would be these big long lists of what women were buying, how much they were paying for it, when they were purchasing it. And as I kind of kept using them to try and think about women's clothing, I got really, I never thought I'd be a historian interested in numbers, but actually I became fascinated by them because I think we often look at accounts as sources from which we can extract information, but don't pay that much attention to how they're being written, why they're being written. And it just struck me really as I kept doing this work that women are quite left out of this kind of bigger story of the impact of accounting in the early modern period. And I don't think that should be the case. To take your second question, so all of the examples that I've shown today are from public archives. So I think the Mellish family are from the Nottingham University Archives. I've used the West Yorkshire Archives. Elizabeth Wentworth's account book is actually available in the British Library. So I've used publicly available repositories so far. One thing that has really struck me is that there are so many of these things out there. And that's something that I want to keep doing in the future. There are so many women's account books just kind of tucked away in collections of family papers, which show us that so many women were doing this kind of work. And one of the challenges is often that they are anonymous or they don't have kind of a specific name attached to them. So I think Mrs. Plum is one nice example of that. Her account book, I think, has ended up in the archive because her son married kind of a big family in Bradford, and that's why it's kept there. But very often they're kind of anonymous, or like in the case of Elizabeth Wentworth, all we can really find is this one example, but I still think they're worth exploring. But yeah, I haven't haven't managed to dive into kind of private archives yet, but I imagine they will be a fantastic resource, and we'll have lots of this material. Thank you.
Anybody else?
You mentioned that Elizabeth Wentworth went up to London and spent more money when she was in London. I did wonder about the £4 that went missing, whether that could have been gambling related.
Absolutely right. I do wonder sometimes where she's so we actually do find lots of women, particularly in these small pocketbooks, which I think were obviously quite handy for taking out on a night out, and then keeping track of gambling losses or gains, but more often losses. So yeah, I think possibly that's something that's happening with Elizabeth Wentworth. Absolutely. I'm quite cynical. I feel like a bit mean about her sometimes. Actually, I'm quite cynical because I do wonder if some of the times where she notes, for example, giving a shilling to a poor man, if she's actually doing that, or if that's kind of quite a handy shorthand for accounting for some of this. But yeah, I think particularly when she was in London, that could have been the case. Yeah. Thank you.
A lot of the examples you've given have been of genteel women. Have you seen any examples of working women that have kept accounts of everything they've been doing?
Really wonderful question, and the short answer is I would love to. I mean, yes and no. I think, as I highlighted in the talk, it is kind of, particularly in the late 17th and early 18th century, it is largely genteel kind of elite women, but lots of middling women as well are learning to account because they're living in these commercial environments. But it is a skill that you do need to be literate for. And actually that gets kind of overlooked in a lot of discussions. You needed to be able to write, and you needed to be numerate and have numerical skills. So I haven't found kind of personal account books belonging to women kind of below the middling classes in the same way that I have for obviously women of the elites and gentry. This doesn't mean that they weren't keeping account. It just means that maybe they haven't survived. There were lots of women who did run businesses, for example, who obviously kind of kept account in some ways, and some historians have explored those. And one of the things I find really interesting is that although we might not necessarily have account books kept by poor women or labouring women in archives, if you go in and look at collections of bills and receipts, women are running businesses like seamstresses, for example, and issuing receipts. So they're obviously keeping track of their expenditure in some way. So there is one fantastic example of an account book kept by kind of a labouring yeoman farmer called Richard Latham. But that's kind of really the only example of a full account book. But I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that women further down the social hierarchy couldn't keep account. They just might have done so in different ways, or unfortunately they might not have survived. But maybe one day, fingers crossed, I'll find something. Thank you.
So you've talked a lot about pocketbooks, and I guess my question, and I'm glad you've said you're interested in women's fashion, because today women's clothes have very few pockets. I'm very conscious I'm sat here with a jacket and trousers that have got fake pockets in, and I can't even put anything in. So my question really is, did women back then have practical usable pockets? And if so, what happened? Why have we not got them?
I really want to put my hand in my pocket. Yeah, because I do have one. Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And women did have very big pockets in this period. I don't have a picture of them, for example, so I'm afraid you might have to make do with one of my terrible kind of descriptions. But basically, women had pockets that tied around their waist and were underneath, or worn underneath their gown or petticoats. And actually, if you look at surviving examples, they can be quite big. They were kind of essentially like mini bags strapped to their sides. And there's a really fantastic book about pockets in this period. And you find women keeping all sorts in there. It's a very private space for them in some ways. I'm trying to think of the most ridiculous example. I think there's one example of a woman who kind of stole some ducks by shoving them in her pockets. I think that's quite an extreme one. But yeah, there were these quite big spaces where women could actually keep quite a lot. And because their skirts were so big, really, that meant that they were quite hidden in different ways. So I think pocketbooks could have very easily fitted into some of these things. I can't, other historians are better than me on this, and I can't explain entirely why we don't have as many pockets today. Lots of people have kind of suggested that with the advent of empire line fashions in the early 19th century, kind of pockets disappeared, but I don't think that's the case. So I think it's a particularly kind of 19th and 20th century development, but certainly in 17th and 18th century, women had these huge pockets that were often quite beautifully decorated as well, even though they were worn underneath their gowns.
Remembering back from when you started about Elizabeth Wentworth, have you verified that the amounts that she spent were actually potentially correct, or was it just an arithmetical exercise in being able to add up amounts of money?
Back to some of my suspicions about her accounting. I haven't sat and kind of gone through every page and verified every sum. As I've highlighted, I have found these instances where things don't match up, or where you can quite clearly see how she was doing this, but I haven't gone through and added everything up to make sure that they were correct. I have done it for other women and other account books, and very often they're not right. Very often their totals are incorrect. And sometimes that's kind of by a few pence. Sometimes it's quite wildly off. And it does make me think a little bit about their kind of numeracy, but also kind of the difficulties of doing these sums. I mean, I use a computer to do them now. I use a calculator. They obviously did not have that. So there are two things that we might think about here. I think on the one hand, perhaps some of them simply made mistakes, and that's completely understandable. Perhaps some of them were massaging figures, like potentially Elizabeth Wentworth, but perhaps sometimes what we're seeing are just mistakes. The other thing that I've been trying to think about, however, is that I've been trying to consider the possibility that these women had knowledge that we don't have. So perhaps they're keeping account, adding up these sums, but remember that they spent 3 shillings yesterday, so they add that to their total. So there are some things there that we can't necessarily get at, but I think imagining perhaps the possibility that it's not just women adding up badly is quite an important one. But I will certainly try that with her, with Elizabeth Wentworth. Thank you.
It's really interesting looking at the lists of items that they were purchasing, particularly Elizabeth Wentworth, who was a young lady able to spend money on herself. But they're showing things which were often ephemeral and transient: hats, clothing, textiles. Have you had any opportunity to compare those sorts of lists and accounts with inventories, which show a very different take on the household composition, but collectively, inventories rarely show that ephemera? And this could be a new source to combine with looking at a house.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been very interested in wills and kind of probate records. I've looked less at inventories, partly because actually they don't often include clothing, as you say, which as a historian of clothing is a bit frustrating. But yeah, I think that's a really wonderful point. I mean, one of the things, Elizabeth Wentworth is not such a good example of this. But in account books like that belonging to Joan Mellish and household account books, we can see this more, or we can see the maintenance of the household more. So we can see that they're making payments to have linens washed, for example, or things darned, or have things repaired or altered. So I think it would be really wonderful to kind of read some of that alongside something like an inventory. The problem often is that we don't have, or don't necessarily have, inventories for the same people that we have account books, which is one of my eternal frustrations. So it would have to be kind of an exercise in looking for similar objects. But yeah, I think that could be a really valuable source for this, because again, they give that kind of focus, not just on the newly purchased, which something like Elizabeth Wentworth's account book does. Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so if you would like to join me in thanking Lizzy for
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. So as I said before at the beginning, if anyone does have any suggestions of who we might invite for the autumn, do come and find me. I'm very interested to hear your ideas. And thanks ever so much for coming, and hopefully you won't get too soggy on the way home. See you later.